The top three from qualifying ended the race on the podium in a slightly different order, but that didn't tell half the story of the Spanish Grand Prix. We'll review it all in just a moment.
As you said in the intro, we had the top three in qualifying also as the top three in the race, just in a slightly different order. Max Verstappen getting round Lando to take P1, Lando ending in P2, and Lewis Hamilton in P3. Did this order surprise you, or was that always what was going to happen?
Yeah, I can't say I'm massively surprised by the top three, to be honest. I did think maybe at the start we were going to see a little George Russell win, as he was sort of pulling away from the pack after that insane move into turn one. But obviously, as soon as Max took it back on lap two, I think we all knew which way the race was going. But then again, obviously, Lando had a lot of pace throughout the race. So it looked like it could have gone his way. But yeah, I think that top three was always kind of expected.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it was a massively surprising top three. I was slightly surprised, as you said, not to see George up there, but happy to see Lewis back on the podium, his first podium of the year, which is surprising, I think. I, in my head, thought that he'd been up there before this year, but clearly not.
Yeah, Mercedes seemed to find their flow a little bit more again this weekend. Obviously, after Canada, they made some improvements
Mm.
and they were looking pretty fast. So good for them to be back up there. Obviously, they were both very happy with that. And clearly, they're heading in the right direction. Obviously, we had James Allison saying that they had a bit of an oh God moment, realizing that this should have been the concept they were following all along. But I mean, better to find it now than never. And yeah, hopefully, we'll see some improvements for them throughout the next races and see how they go in Austria and Silverstone.
Yeah, definitely. I think if anything, this race showed us that we're really on for a championship battle this year, not only between the top spots, but also further down for that fourth place, for that third place in the constructors between potentially now Ferrari and Mercedes if McLaren carry on being this strong as well. So exciting now going into this triple head and knowing that we've got a real competition on our hands. Obviously, Max Verstappen taking the win in Spain. We saw him on the winning soft, medium, soft strategy. That seemed to be the fastest option out there today. You should always obviously be taking the softest compound you possibly can to get the maximum grip and pace. And we saw both Max doing that and also Lando. Do you think Max's strategy had the edge today? He pitted just a few laps earlier than Lando for both of his stops. And do you think that's what made the difference?
Yeah, definitely. I think that McLaren left Lando out slightly too long for his
Mm.
strategy to work out. Obviously, we had that point of the race where Max was behind Lando and Lando was still in the mediums. I think there was a 17-second gap to close up over, I think it was like 21 laps. So I was wondering if they were going to keep Lando out on those mediums, but I'm not sure they would have lasted. So I think McLaren had a tricky choice to pick between staying out on those mediums and coming in to go for the softs and lose track position, but then try and catch up to Max. And obviously that didn't quite work out for them. And Lando being very, very hard on himself, that sort of the difference was in his start, and that's where he lost all the time. And had he had a better start, he could have won the race.
Yeah, we should actually touch on that start, I think. A bit interesting there between Max, Lando, and then also unexpectedly George, who came around the outside and seemed to sort of catch them both sleeping a little bit, I think. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I think Max and Lando were probably a little bit too focused on each other and left the door open for George to slip around the outside. Obviously, it's quite a long run down to turn one anyway. I think it's about 600 metres, so he was able to get a good slipstream. We also had him saying that he looked at the weather report and seen there was quite a strong headwind into turn one, so he knew he was able to go slightly deeper in and still make it around the corner in time. So obviously quite impressive. He's using everything to his advantage there, and it worked out for him. So yeah, you really can't complain. A great move there from George Russell.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was a little bit kind of perplexed as to why Lando and Max, obviously they're fighting each other so hard, but they should have been obviously watching that outside as well. As a massive gap there that then George took advantage of. Couldn't hang on to it though through the race. Obviously ended up P4 just off the podium with his teammate Lewis ahead. But I think we should come back to Max and Red Bull a little bit more. And give a word to Sergio Perez. What did you make of his weekend? Because I found it rather forgettable, to be honest.
Yeah, I think he seems to have fallen a little bit back into that poor weekend
Mm.
flow that he had last year. He hasn't had a great result now for a little while. And again, yeah, as you said, it's kind of a forgettable weekend. Yeah, I think something needs to change there. Obviously, he's just re-signed that contract with Red Bull. I think they're going to be looking at that now and wondering whether they've made the right choice. But again, things can change very quickly in Formula One. He could come back now in Austria and win the race, but
Mhm.
yeah, it's not looking too good at the moment.
No, what I found the most interesting about this, like you could blame it on his grid drop and all this, but he also realistically didn't qualify that high, even in spite of the grid drop. But after the race, I think it was Christian Horner came on the radio and was praising him for a very strong weekend. So I don't know if the expectation of what they want from him has dropped, whether they're happy with a P8 finish. I can't imagine they would be, but it kind of feels like they're forgetting or kind of moving past the fact he's not finishing very well anymore and taking that as a good weekend for him. So we did see some good moves from him through the race, to be fair, but you could argue he shouldn't be having to make those moves in the first place.
Exactly. And I think we've said it before, but going back to qualifying, now everything's so much closer. That sort of 2-3 tenth gap he always had to Max is now, P10, because everything's so close that all these other people can now slot in that gap. And I think on another note, Red Bull are going to have to be very, very careful with the Constructors' Championship, because obviously they've got Ferrari and now McLaren looking very, very strong. And if Lando and Piastri, say, are able to get more points combined than Max and Sergio, then there's going to be a little bit of a problem for Red Bull come the end of the year.
Yeah, they've been kind of lucky so far that Oscar's had a lot of bad luck. And has also had a couple of weekends now where he's not had such a good and high qualifying position, because we know when he's up there, he can stay up there in a race and convert that to some really good points. So Red Bull have been lucky in that sense. But I'd be interested to see now over the rest of this triple header what happens to the gap there, and also how Oscar is able to match, if not do better than Sergio Perez as a second driver too. I think it's pretty obvious now it'll be Lando that's going for the challenge rather than Oscar.
Yeah, so obviously we've already touched a little bit on McLaren and their strategy, but I want to have another little bit of a deeper look into this. Obviously, we had Lando extend out slightly longer than Max did. Just wondering what you think of this, and do you think that was the right decision for McLaren, or are they starting to have some strategy blunders as they're in these higher up positions? Are they not quite ready to be fighting at these higher up places? Is the car too good for the team? What do you think?
I think blunders is perhaps a little bit harsh. I think they just have a different way of working that has suited them so far to this point, where they've not been running at the front, where you have to be making these really quick, decisive decisions in a race. You have to act on the information you're getting during the race, not necessarily on the pre-planned strategy you've gone for. You have to be a little bit more reactive but also proactive in that sense. And I would say that McLaren are being less proactive and more reactive to their plan that they've already got in place, if that makes sense. Yes, supposedly Lando was the quickest on track. Looking at the average race pace data, he was second to Max in race pace, but very close. And I think that potentially comes from running through traffic, whereas Max had a bit of clean air while Lando was stuck making up the places that he'd lost by pitting that second time. But the thing that I find the most interesting, I think, about the way McLaren run their strategy is how much they liaise with the driver and how much they ask Lando's opinion. Particularly, we don't hear it so much with Oscar, I don't think, potentially because they just don't show us the radios. But I think they're always toing and froing with Lando about his strategy decisions, what tyre he'd like to be on. We saw it in Canada as well, in that critical moment, should they come into the pit as the safety car came out. They had a very split-second decision to make there, and they were so busy worrying about what compound they would go on when they stopped that they missed their call, and obviously then that perhaps you could argue cost Lando the win that time. So I think it was a similar kind of thing today. They waited a bit too long, I think, making that decision. They said they always wanted to extend, but when others are stopping earlier, if you're surprised by others stopping earlier, you should be reacting to that and potentially considering stopping earlier yourself. So yeah, I would like to see them stop asking Lando so much and tell Lando, we're going to do this, what do you think? Rather than saying, what would you like to do? And kind of going in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting point. It's strange to me because obviously the engineers have so much more data than Lando has available to him in the car. Obviously, he has the feel and he knows what it's like out on track. But surely back at the MTC, they have all these algorithms running, figuring out like, okay, if Lando is 0.5 of a second faster, where does he play? These different strategies being run by computers, and yet they always still go to the driver. And I think it's important to get the driver's opinion.
Of course, yeah.
But I think they might rely on it slightly too much. And perhaps this is something that they'll need to improve if they are to fight for the Constructors' Championship or even for a Drivers' Championship, because we see teams like Red Bull consistently getting it right, even when they don't have the fastest car. And that's what we saw today. Well, apparently not with your race pace simulations, but I think maybe that's something that McLaren need to learn. And maybe they are just learning to be a front-running team. They've had a good car now since Austria last year. they haven't really had that much time to build in these processes. I mean, a year is a long time, but you know, it's hard when you're constantly trying to develop the car to put these different processes in place between engineers and drivers. I think it's something that would require a lot of experimentation between engineer and driver to figure out a good balance of getting an opinion and just following the data and making the choices with a data informed view.
Mm.
So yeah, I think obviously that's something that they need to work on.
Yeah, I think we have to remember as well, it's very easy to criticize McLaren, like as we've just done, to be fair, about their strategy and how from the outside it looks like an obvious decision that you should be bringing him in earlier or putting him on a different compound, for example. But we also have to remember that McLaren are going up against Red Bull, an incredibly well-oiled machine when it comes to strategy. But he's also up against Max Verstappen, who has an incredible relationship with his engineer GP, and GP doesn't take any nonsense from Max. You know, GP has the plan he's following that he's been told by the team at Milton Keynes or on the track or at the track. And he follows that whether Max likes it or not, in a way, and kind of
Mm.
that's the plan, and they always go with that plan, and that's the winning plan in most of the cases. So yeah, I think it will just come with practice with McLaren. It's the same thing we've kind of seen with Mercedes and a bit with George as well, where he's made some little mistakes towards the end of a race where he's front running just because he's barely ever run at the front. We forget he's come from Williams, you know, and has had a bad car at Mercedes up until potentially this year. Um, it's all just practice, I think, but I do think it's interesting. That's one part I find very interesting about McLaren's strategy. If you just listen to the onboard with Lando, particularly the amount he's asked, and obviously he's always going to back himself, isn't he? As he's an F1
Yeah.
driver, they're not going to say, no, I can't do that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's something we haven't seen for a while. Obviously,
Mm,
we had the battle with Red Bull and Mercedes, and those were two very well-oiled machines. And then now we've come to these new regulations. It's been Red Bull, Red Bull, Red Bull kind of thing.
yeah,
And now we are starting to get some new people fighting at the top, like McLaren, who haven't been at the top for such a long time. We're
yeah.
seeing what it's like for a Formula One team to develop into something more powerful that is able to fight at the front. So yeah, I think it's cool to see. Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
it's a fascinating process, and I think it's also made more fascinating when they get it right. And I hope they can start to get it right and hopefully make those decisions. And I think I felt a little bit bad for Lando today because he was blaming it on himself and his start a lot. And from my point of view and my opinion, it wasn't just his start. Yes, obviously that was a factor, but I also think his strategy today was a little bit problematic.
Yeah, talking about getting it right, we're seeing some struggles from Oscar over at McLaren at the moment. He's complaining that the car isn't quite where he wants it to be. Obviously, we saw him have quite a strong start to the year, and that seems to have fallen off a little bit now. Could you talk us through a little bit how his race went today?
Yeah, I think Oscar's day today was made a little bit more difficult by his qualifying. He said he was unable to unlock the pace through a lot of the weekend. He also said it got better for him in the second half of the race, but that the strategy sort of made it look better than it actually was. So I think he's got a little bit of work to do, and he'll be working obviously with his engineers now in this week, in the few days actually before Austria, to try and unlock that bit of pace on a track that now is very similar to Spain, and then on to Silverstone as well, which is similar again, these mid to high speed sort of traditional racetracks now, and he'll want to get that right so he doesn't cost himself any more points.
Yeah, obviously, as I said earlier, we saw McLaren bring their big upgrades that sort of brought them to be front runners in Austria last year. And I think we had Silverstone after Austria, and obviously Oscar was pretty strong in Silverstone. So it'll be interesting to see now at a track where we've seen him be strong before, whether he'll be able to bring that form back, or maybe something isn't quite right with the car that they're going to need to work on for him to make him a little bit more comfortable.
Yeah, these are tracks that have typically favoured the McLaren, especially last year, as you said, after those upgrades. Lando's obviously got a podium scoring history at Austria, and also Lando was on the podium last year, both of them in the top three in qualifying in Silverstone. So interesting couple of races coming up for McLaren, I think, that will really show where they're at, but also where they're at in the championship order as well, versus Ferrari, particularly, who have traditionally now this year been the second running team. I think that could be switching. On to Mercedes, it was an overall very positive weekend for both of them, I think. George obviously had that fantastic start, just missed out on the podium, and Lewis back on the podium for the first time this year. How do you rate their weekend, and do you think Mercedes are back?
Yeah, I think they definitely had a strong weekend. They had a new floor on the car, which has obviously gone quite well for them. Um, I think it's too early to say whether they're back or not yet. Obviously, we have this run now of more traditional type tracks. So it'll be interesting to see when we get back to sort of the street tracks, whether they're going to still be running at the front. But I think it's refreshing for them, and you can see it on Lewis's face as well. Like heading into the weekend, he obviously looked a bit down and stuff, and now at the end he was saying it's his best weekend of the year. I think he said best weekend of the last 15 races. So, that goes back into last year as well then. So yeah, I think they're definitely going to be happy to be running back at the front. As I said earlier, James Allison saying that they had an oh God moment when they realised what they'd done. Not really 100% sure what he's referring to there. I'm assuming it's something to do with the floor. But yeah, it's nice to see them getting things right. And hopefully they can continue that momentum and we can have another team fighting it towards the front.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it comes down to the floor, but I think it also comes down to that front wing that they introduced for George in Monaco, and then both of them had it in Canada last time out. And I think that has been instrumental in this recovery that they've had. And all they need to do really now is just keep this momentum going. They don't want to go backwards now, and hopefully they don't. Hopefully they can keep bringing parts that align with this direction they want to go in and keep improving, because the more teams we have at the front, the more exciting it is for everyone. One team that seems to have dropped off a little bit this weekend and also last time out in Canada is potentially Ferrari. Yes, this time was a bit of a recovery compared to 2 DNFs that we had in Canada for them. But do you think this situation is really that bad for them, or do you think that they are still up there as potentially the second fastest team compared to Red Bull?
Yeah, I don't think it's as bad as it looked today. I think coming into the race, they had pretty bad quali for being Ferraris. Fred Vasseur, the team principal, was saying that they probably had the same race pace as Mercedes. So that really can't be too bad if Mercedes were on the podium. Fred was also saying that they did a good job on strategy. We had Carlos do the soft, medium, hard, and Charles did the soft, medium, soft. And I think both drivers were quite happy with their strategy. Charles was saying that they did well to offset the strategy against the others. So no, I don't think it's quite as bad as it looks from the outside. Perhaps just because Mercedes have now made a bit of a jump, were a little bit faster than Ferrari, and so sort of knocked them off those podium positions. But yeah, I think Ferrari probably have a little bit of work to do just to make sure that they get ahead of Mercedes now. But Fred was saying that the pace will be as it is for a couple of months. So I don't know, maybe it's not going to look so good in a few months' time. That seems like quite a long time to me. But yeah, we'll see.
Maybe that means they're not planning any more upgrades. They accelerated this upgrade package this weekend, I think. It was planned for a few more races down the line and they brought it to Spain. So maybe that means they've used their upgrade allowance or their budget now for a little while, and they're just going to see how they go and try and keep going with this car. Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I don't think it's as bad as it looks for Ferrari. I think Charles was on that softer, faster tyre towards the end. I think that helped him out. Carlos struggled a bit more on the hard, that he was sort of sliding around a bit. I think we also have to mention the little bit of infighting we saw between them. Got a little bit spicy out there for a while. Very close into turn one, and I think there was contact, wasn't there? And then a bit of whining on the radio from Carlos about how it didn't come to a penalty, and what's the point in having a rule book if the stewards don't even pay any attention to it. So always nice to hear some complaining on the radio.
Yeah, I think they're still going at it a bit now as well, to be honest. I saw something on social media that they were still complaining about each other. So hopefully that doesn't go sour, because I think they've had quite a good relationship as teammates over their time at Ferrari. And I hope that doesn't sour now in the last few races, in the last season before obviously Carlos moves wherever Carlos moves. We'll have to wait for his announcement. Obviously, we didn't get anything quite this weekend. There were some rumours that we would. But Carlos has been quite open that he hasn't really looked at it yet, and that he finds it difficult to decide because he's so busy now thinking about winning races in Ferrari that his options that he has left of Williams and Sauber are tough for him to choose between, because he knows he's not going to win for a while. So yeah, I think it might be a while until we hear what decision he's made.
Yeah, I think that kind of, what you've just said, I hadn't heard that. And I think that kind of affirms to me what we said in the driver market video and podcast that we put out last week, I believe, that he's gone into this driver market almost thinking that he should be having one of these top seats, and yet there are no top seats available. And so now I think he's a little bit thrown by that. And based on what you've just said, I think that sort of backs that up a bit. So yeah, interesting. Yeah, I kind of think he just needs to decide based on what's in front of him now and get the best of what's turned out to be a little bit of a bad situation. And that doesn't mean that in a couple of years he couldn't move to a top team if a seat becomes available.
Yeah, I can imagine that's quite tough for him though, because obviously he hasn't done anything wrong to lose that Ferrari seat. It's just
No,
the
of
fact that,
course, yeah.
Lewis is a 7-time world champion, kind of gets priority if he wants to go to a
Yeah.
team. They're obviously not going to say no.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a difficult situation for him to be in, and I can understand why it's probably hard for him to now have to choose between Williams or Sauber.
Yeah.
As we understand, obviously Mercedes don't seem to be interested in him. I mean, if he could convince them otherwise, then that might be an option for him to now stay and have the potential to win a race, especially if Mercedes continue at their current rate. But yeah, it's looking like he's going to have to pick between Williams and Sauber, so we'll have to see which way that goes.
I think it's hard for people to sort of look into the long term, especially when he is, as you say, used to winning races and sort of running at the front. Less so, obviously, in the last couple of weekends, but taking an average, that's how Ferrari have been these last couple of years. And I think it's probably difficult to go from that to thinking I need to think in the long term here, and he might have to go through a couple of years of pain to get that long term gain. So yeah, I can imagine it's tough for Carlos at the moment, and maybe that's why we're seeing these little blips of kind of potentially technique and stuff, and hitting your teammate is not really ideal, and maybe his mind's elsewhere at the moment.
So moving on away from a little bit of driver market stuff as we got into there, obviously it's a very exciting time for all of that. We had RB bring some big upgrades to their car this weekend, saying that the only thing the same about the car was the front wing. Obviously, they didn't really show that in their results. They didn't show that the upgrades had worked. Can you talk us through a little bit what happened there?
Yeah, so they had 7 different upgrades, I believe, going into the weekend. Some on the floor, they had a new beam wing, track specific. They had a track specific rear wing that they've sort of added a medium high downforce rear wing to their pool now for the coming races. Some alterations to their side pod and their side pod inlets. So quite a big sort of upgrade package. As you said, apparently the only thing that's remained the same is the front wing. And I think they've worked in a sense because both drivers feel positive with the car, but they're just lacking load. We heard Daniel Ricciardo saying that they don't have enough load, which on these high speed, medium to high speed tracks is incredibly detrimental to their pace. As we've seen this weekend, they've been running way at the back of the grid in all practice sessions, in quali, and then in the race. I think Danny made it up to P15, which is probably the best that they could have expected this time. So yeah, I don't think they'll be feeling too downbeat about the steps they've taken in the upgrades, because obviously the car feeling is still good. They just need to then add on little bits now and kind of try to get that load back that will hopefully make the difference, because we're going into a run of another 2 medium to high speed tracks that they'll need these performances on. So yeah, I hope it gets better for them, because it's a bit rough, I think, this weekend.
Yeah, they're definitely going to be having a look now over the next week and trying to get those sorted out for Austria.
Yeah.
I think maybe Austria's a little bit too soon. We could see them improve, but I think Silverstone might be the big teller as whether they've made a good improvement with these upgrades or whether they've kind of gone down the wrong route. We also saw UK have a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane. Obviously not too much touch on there. I think Kevin Magnussen had one as well. So a couple of offenders this time round on the speeding front. But yeah, again, there's nothing really to say about that. It's not anything that's
No,
going to lead to
Yuki
anything.
just sort of struggled in the race regardless of that penalty. I think he was running at the back and couldn't really make up the positions. Started at the back, ended at the back, and was running at the back for most of the race. And unlike Danny, we were seeing Danny make overtakes and stuff. We didn't really see that so much from Yuki. So maybe just something gone wrong there for Yuki and his setup and his feel with the car. But yesterday he was quite surprised that he hadn't qualified higher, which I think speaks to the fact that the feel of the car was fine. He felt that he should have been up higher and was really shocked when he didn't get through Q1. So yeah, interesting couple of races coming up for them, I think.
So moving away from RB and onto some other back runners, obviously Williams, we had Alex Albon starting from the pit lane. He decided to start the race on a medium. Obviously, I think they needed to roll the dice a little bit on strategy. Going the same as everybody else was never going to put them ahead. Obviously, we saw an interesting moment from Alex Albon at turn 12. I think that they've now blamed that on the wind, but he was saying that he wasn't even pushing on the tyres, and he sort of had a moment where the car just went off track. And he wanted to know, we saw the radio message come up on the broadcast, he wanted to know what was going on there. The team said that everything was fine. But he seemed a little bit, agitated by that. So I wonder what's going on there. If there's maybe something with the car, I'm really not sure. Obviously, they blamed it on wind now. But do you think we need to look into that at all?
I think I feel like we've seen this before from the Williams that it's quite prone to being affected by the wind. I can't think of a specific example, but something's ringing a bell for me there that we've seen this before.
Yeah, I think last
Um,
year maybe there
yeah.
was some stuff about it.
Um,
Yeah.
so kind of unusual that their car is overweight and yet being blown around by the wind. So I'm not entirely sure that physics wise, I don't think that makes much sense. Um, yeah, I think a bit of a reality check weekend for Williams generally. They were the worst for race pace by over half a second this weekend to VCARB. So obviously the car is still holding on to quite a lot of the weight that it had at the start of the year, despite the upgrades they bought in Canada to try and reduce that. And they've also got less downforce than most of the rest of the field. So tough weekend for them from both sides, and I think that probably would have helped Logan Sargent and his performance sort of get a little bit swept under the rug because it wasn't great for him either.
Yeah, I think we're seeing Logan have some slightly cleaner weekends than he's had previously. Um, but he's had some problems with their upgraded floor. They don't seem to be resonating with him too well. And we saw a shot of the side of the Williams floor where they've made some changes to it to try and help improve the feel for him. But yeah, obviously Logan's going through a bit of a tough time at the moment. It feels like he's a little bit downbeat. Maybe he's kind of coming to the reality of, there's not really a seat available next year from what it seems for him. It
Yeah.
seems like Williams are looking elsewhere. They're looking at Carlos, they're looking at Valtteri rather than Logan. So yeah, he's going through a bit of a tough time at the moment, and it's always a shame to see that. I think for a driver, you don't want to see anybody get kicked out of Formula One, but it seems it's heading that way.
Yeah, I think it's harsh on Logan. I think the way Williams are sort of handling this whole driver market situation, they're very publicly going after Carlos and potentially then Valtteri as a backup and not really giving any word to Logan at all and how he's sort of performing for them in the here and now.
Mm.
And they're just sort of assuming that he's not going to be there in the future. I think their mind is made up, regardless of what he does, which is obviously a very tough situation to be in for him.
So speaking about people who are leaving Spain feeling a little bit downbeat, we've got Aston Martin, who didn't really have a very good qualifying. They didn't have a great race. Obviously, Fernando was quite happy after qualifying, which was odd. Qualified P11. Um, yeah, what's going on at Aston Martin?
Um, Not really too sure. I don't think they've had some upgrades, but they've not really done too much. I don't think. And Fernando seems to think they're going to struggle now coming into the next few races of this triple header. Um, yeah, I just don't think they have the pace. They're sixth on race pace, quite a bit behind Alpine, who have moved up this weekend. Obviously, they've had a quite an incredible weekend for them. And I believe Aston Martin have also lost their place to Haas in the Constructors' Championship now, which isn't good. And VCAR potentially are coming for them as well if they can recover these upgrades and sort of get that sorted out in the next couple of races. So on a bit of a downward spiral. But I think interestingly, Fernando was really happy after his qualifying, and he was sort of chuffed that that was the best that they were going to get, and he got it. So he doesn't seem too stressed about it. So maybe we shouldn't read into it too much.
Yeah, we saw a little mistake from him at the start of the race where he had to go off the escape road.
Mm,
Nothing too deep to go into there, I don't think. But Aston Martin were a little bit in no man's land strategy wise. They had
yeah.
some awkward stop times and a little bit of an awkward strategy overall. Fernando said we didn't have the pace. Barcelona puts you in the pace order, nothing to hide. So obviously, it's maybe a little bit of a reality check for Aston Martin. We know they're disappointed with where they are at the moment. I think because Barcelona does have these sort of characteristics to put you back in pace order, maybe they are seeing the reality of the situation. It's also looking a little bit bleak in their future as well. They don't have much coming to Silverstone or Spielberg in terms of upgrades. So it's going to be a little bit of a while before I think we see any improvements from Aston Martin.
On to things that are a little bit more optimistic. An incredible weekend for Alpine, I think. Double points for them, and the first time they had both cars in Q3 as well in qualifying. How do you think they've managed to produce this result?
I'm not really too sure, to be honest. Esteban was saying that they were expecting a tough weekend heading into Spain. But now, because of their strong performance here, they're expecting to be pretty good at the next three races, because obviously we're still at traditional tracks for those. Yeah, I don't know. It's a bit of a strange one because They have been making little steps, I think, but this was a massive step for them to both be in the points at the end of the race. Obviously, Bruno Famin, the team principal, was a little bit disappointed that they lost out on P8 on the last lap of the race to Checo. But I don't think there's anything to be disappointed from this weekend for Alpine. You know, a double points finish from where they were is massive.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if it's got anything to do with Flavio Briatore coming back and telling them to turn everything up, or if they've just sort of been working together a bit more as a team this week. It feels there's been less sort of arguments between the teammates. They weren't really close together on track much, I don't think. And when they were and they had to pass each other, it was clean. So yeah, it just feels like they've sort of turned a corner a little bit, and there's a positive feeling within the team. And I don't particularly know why. Maybe they've made some technical signings or something that we're not yet aware of. But again, shout out to Jack Doohan as well, putting in the work on the simulator for them. It all seems to have been running well this weekend. And I hope it continues for them, because it's not nice to see a team downbeat every weekend and not doing so well. So the more people we've got fighting, as we said earlier, the better for everyone and for fans and for the Constructors' Championship as well. So, and we could do with a lot of movement down that end of the Constructors' Championship as well to watch all the way to Abu Dhabi.
Absolutely. I think it'll be interesting to see now if they do follow through on these next 3 weekends, and whether they can continue these performances or whether it was just a one-off. Hopefully not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope the peace is kept for long enough for them to enjoy it as well.
So that's our review of the Spanish Grand Prix. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to drop a like, and also let us know in the comments, who do you think will be strong in Austria? And as always, subscribe to Apex for more deep dives into the F1 world.